Mill is leaving things at an abstract level, again for the two reasons that I stated earlier, so that it will apply broadly and so that we can start to think about the presuppositions underlying his general claim. Another important thing to keep in mind about the harm principle that matters just as much in Chapter 4 as it does in Chapter 1 is that this does not apply to everyone. It applies to adults. It applies probably only to people we consider to have a certain threshold of mental ability. If you're developmentally disabled, probably Mill would exclude you. He excludes children. He excludes probably the developmentally disabled. And most problematically, this is one of the places where we're probably going to feel a little unhappy with Mill. It shows his own social location. He says this principle does not apply to barbarians. It does not apply to people in uncivilized countries. You remember when I was quoting from the Chapter 1 version of the harm principle a couple of moments ago, he uses the word civilized. So this principle does not apply in uncivilized countries. And as you may know, Mill was a bureaucrat in the part of the British government that was controlling the Indian government at that time, because India was a continent. And perhaps that's part of what he had in mind. It's problematic for us because we would like to think that generally it doesn't really matter what country you come from. You are capable of rational self-development. But Mill's point of view was that children and barbarians have not yet had the experiences and the training that they need in order to be able to develop themselves toward full human flourishing, toward eudaimonia. So remember, again, the harm principle is not about abstract rights. The harm principle is a way to get the consequences Mill is interested in, the best developmental opportunities that will move everyone toward happiness. If I leave 5-year-olds free to do whatever they want, am I going to get that best developmental consequence? Probably no. Even very bright 5-year-olds don't yet understand enough about the world to know that it's not a good idea to test heat by putting your hand on a hot stove burner. Don't know that it's not a good idea to run out in traffic to test the properties of physics and see whether or not the human body is capable of being smashed under a semi. They need a little bit of training before we want to leave children free to make their own autonomous choices. And Mill has the same thought in mind, sadly, for barbarians. So the harm principle does not apply to those cases. And what we find as we move into chapters 2 and 3 is some extra broadening of the ideas that Mill has in mind. We got a little bit already around the first chapter's statement of the harm principle, some extra understanding about how to apply it and why it's valuable. As we move into chapter 2 and 3, Mill gives us a much richer statement of what the harm principle can do for us. And that presumably is why he waits until chapter 4 to give us the full version of the harm principle. He wants to elaborate all of the background conditions that go into making the harm principle work in 2 and 3 before we get the full statement in chapter 4. So in chapter 2, we have Mill talking about why we ought to be left free to have our own opinions and to discuss them openly with others. So what we're backing up against in chapter 2 is knowledge. Whether or not we actually know the things we know, whether or not our beliefs have any foundation. And in order to understand some of the arguments that Mill will give about the value of listening to one another's opinions in chapter 2, we ought to take out a moment to get more clear on how he thinks human knowledge actually works. If your teachers have talked with you about the 3 questions, you may remember one of those 3 questions is how do we know? That's the epistemology question. This is Mill's epistemology. This is Mill's answer to the how do we know question. And broadly speaking, there are 3 elements in Mill's epistemology in the answer that Mill would give to how do we know. The first one is fallibilism. It's really important, especially for a proper understanding of chapter 2, that we know that Mill is a fallibilist. He thinks we cannot be certain. We might be wrong. That's the shorthand way to understand what fallibilism is about. You might think you know, you can't be sure. You might be wrong. And that then leads us to a question as we think a little bit more about fallibilism. Well, if I can't have 100% certainty about anything, what makes me think I should take seriously anything I believe? Mill has an answer to that. Again, it's an answer that's part of his fallibilism. And the answer is, if you have done your best to test a belief, if you have repeatedly subjected it to opportunities to learn that it's false, and it didn't come out looking false, that's a belief that actually has some good street cred. That's a belief that has a lot of support. It's still not a belief that we should consider 100% certain. But the fact that I experimented with it, I tried to find out if there was something wrong with it, and I haven't yet found anything wrong with it, means I've got more warrant, more reason to take that belief seriously than one that I haven't yet tested at all. And Mill thinks that this is not only important for understanding Chapter 2, it's also important for understanding Chapter 3, and it's also going to be something that we want to keep in mind more broadly for thinking about how Mill fits into the modern Western worldview. As you start thinking about science, for E.O. Wilson's text, the idea of testing our beliefs, testing our scientific hypotheses becomes very important. It's not always clear that Wilson is actually a fallibilist, but it is an important approach to answering the how do we know question for modern Western people. So fallibilism is one of the important elements of Mill's epistemology, of his answer to the knowledge question. Another important element of Mill's epistemology is empiricism. Mill thinks that we learn best through experience. That's what empiricism means. It means that we're focused on learning through seeing and hearing and touching and tasting and smelling. The five senses are the way to knowledge. That is also a characteristically modern approach. It's certainly one that E.O. Wilson and other scientists take very, very seriously. In the ancient world, in the medieval world, the emphasis was primarily on reason. That's a little bit of an oversimplification for you philosophers in the room, but there was more of an emphasis on reason, that we could look into our minds, into our internal states, and know the truth. Mill, along with many people in the modern world, thinks, I don't have the truth in me. I need to test the world with my senses in order to learn what is worth taking seriously. And the third element of Mill's epistemology is an orientation towards progress and optimism, a belief that as we continue to test our beliefs fallibilistically, as we continue to look for extra experience, extra empirical support, we are likely never to get to a 100% certain truth, but to get closer to the truth. We are likely to cast off more and more error. And if you think about fallibilism, that makes sense. The more I test beliefs, the more I get rid of the ones that are stupid, and the more I know that the ones that I haven't yet had a reason to throw out have a pretty strong support. Not certainty, but a pretty strong support. So testing is really important because testing moves us into a better future where we know more, or at least are closer to knowing more. When you keep those three presuppositions in mind, Chapter 2 makes an awful lot more sense than it might have otherwise. It still makes pretty good sense, but those presuppositions help us to understand why Mill thinks it's so important to listen to one another in conversation. Mill thinks it's so important to listen to one another in conversation that he poses that question about whether or not we should listen to one another in the most ridiculously difficult way for him to answer possible. Basically, the question of number 2, Chapter 2, is why should the rest of humanity listen to one person that disagrees with everyone else? So imagine 99.99999% of the people alive think X, whatever that is, X is a variable for whatever belief you want to plug in.